Carrie, given your background in starting a classical school and being on the faculty at John Brown University and your experience being a student at Faulkner University, what are some ways to authentically and holistically assess students staying true to the goals of a classical tradition?
Is this on? Check. No. Yes, it is? Oh, okay. Could you repeat the question? So I was fiddling with my mic.
Yes. So given your background, you've been a homeschooling mom, you're going to Faulkner University, getting your PhD in classical education, you opened up a classical school. So giving all of those different but related experiences, what are some ways to authentically and holistically assess students staying true to the goals of a classical education?
So I love this question because, you've demonstrated a great way to assess summatively in education, kind of across the board and comparing students. But I think there's also other ways to assess students holistically. C.S. Lewis talks about in The Abolition of Man, the head, or the mind, the will, and the gut. And I think that we can assess our students in all three of those levels. We can assess their intellect, their will, and even just, especially those little ones, their virtues as far as, keeping still and, raising their hand and being in control of their bodies. So at Sager Classical Academy, we have implemented narrative assessments K through 6. I would love to do that up through 12th grade. I think it's a little harder when parents start to worry about transcripts and colleges want grades and colleges wants test scores. But we are forging ahead with K through 6, and we look at Mortimer Adler's Paideia proposal, which he outlines 3 columns of knowledge, and he talks about facts, he talks about skills, and he talks about ideas, which I think kind of sums up Aristotle's 5 areas of knowledge. So we kind of use those 3 columns as that to cover that. And so in K through 6, we have the teachers each quarter go through what are the facts that their students know in math, or what are the skills are they working on, and what ideas do they discuss. I would say in grammar school, we're mainly we're assessing more of the facts and skills. We're not necessarily assessing their ideas, but we're merely sharing these are the ideas that we're discussing. But and then they have a place for narrating and writing this to parents, and basically they have a conversation with parents during their time together during conferences. And so it took a while to convince teachers. I think first, especially the ones that came from public school, the homeschool teachers were great with it because they're used to that kind of assessment. That's just assessing in relationship. And But the parents were very open to it because they could have real conversations about where their student is. And then we also have a place too for intellectual virtues. So we talk about some of the moral virtues, and then we have a section of intellectual virtues from Jason Baer's Deep in Thought. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that book. He did a lot of study on intellectual virtues, and so we have that segmented out where the parents, the teachers are able to talk specifically about curiosity and humility and learning and carefulness and attentiveness, and really just those things really that have to do with the will and the body, I think, that are, well, actually, I would say all three, mind, soul, and body. And it's really been beneficial to the parents because they get a whole picture of their students. So, that paired maybe with something that's summative might just give you a whole picture of a student, and also just open up conversation and relationship with parent, student, and the teacher.
Thank you, Carrie. I'd like to move to you next, Vince. We learned last night and today when we saw the presentation that Florida is #1 in educational freedom, and so we're so happy to be here with Vince, who has almost 3 decades of experience with the Department of Education. So, Vince, what does FDOE pay attention to most when it comes to implementing new assessments, in addition to just looking at the alignment to the state standards?
Yeah, great question. Could go on a long time because I'm a testing nerd. By the way, I don't tell people I'm in testing. My job is primarily to ensure that schools and districts are administering the tests that are required in state statute. So I tell people that I'm in law enforcement. So, but for our purposes, what we look for, and you said it when you were presenting earlier, you're looking for test results that are valid and reliable for their intended purposes. So you talked about some of the formative uses and so forth. So when we look at it, when we evaluate assessments, we think about, and I'll talk about in the context of CLT, some of the things that you might think about obviously for college entrance. And now that's out of my area. There's actually the board of governors have regulations that actually name ACT and SAT as test scores that must be submitted to colleges. And then of our 12 university systems, they all have their different requirements as far as what ACT and SAT scores. The other option, the other thinking about, is it valid and reliable for use in the Florida college system places? So unlike the 12 universities, we have 28 colleges and 78 campuses across the state, and they use those kinds of scores for placement decisions. So I don't think CLT's on that list there. The other thing, you guys are all familiar with the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship. One of the state requirements is that these schools that use vouchers, there's I think 2,100 schools that take vouchers. I'm a numbers guy, a lot of numbers, that use take vouchers, and those schools can give a state test if they want. Only about 30 to 50 schools a year give the state test. All the other schools give tests that are on a list of approved. I'm like the chief approver. There are about 14 tests that are on that list to collect results for students who are on a scholarship and at a private school, and CLT is actually now on that list as well. So there's a valid, reliable usage. And then the other things, Bright Futures. Right now we have requirements to use SAT and ACT for the Bright Futures. And if there's a place for CLT in that list, that's not for me to say. But I think you've got established validity and reliability for other purposes. So I think that's an important thing to look at where you are with CLT.
Thank you, Vince. So, Bill, tell us more about the work that you do at James Madison Institute that promotes innovative reforms designed to make it possible for all K-12 students to attain a high-quality education, and specifically, if there's anything that you all have doing that has any impact on the assessment world, that would be excellent.
Yeah, so our work is primarily an advocacy role, taking research that's being done out there, looking at policy ideas that are in play, and advocating for options for parents. And invariably in those kinds of discussions, you will encounter questions about, okay, well, how do we know if students are learning, and can we trust this or that option or that sort of thing? So we end up getting questions about, though we aren't obviously experts in the way that others here are, on testing and on standards and that sort of thing, we invariably encounter questions like these from policymakers, and believe these are legitimate concerns, but also believe that there are some real dangers here that are in some ways similar to the dangers that we saw discussed last night, where with the question of funding was a question of strings attached and things of that nature. And I know that there are a lot of folks that when it comes to some of these testing questions, on the one hand, very much affirm the sense that you have, that we want to know how our students are doing and have good assessments done of them that are related to the curriculum that they're learning. But there's also, on the part of some parents, a wariness about how those tests might be used and what will happen if the results aren't what authorities expect or want. And so part of our role is to try to help navigate that landscape in a way that ultimately provides as much, that respects parental authority, and parental rights as much as possible, while at the same time recognizing legitimate taxpayer interest at times on some of these sorts of questions. And we can explore that further as the conversation unfolds, but that's kind of the role that we play in this larger discussion.
Thank you, Carrie. I'll bring it back to you. I was very intrigued by the series of blogs that you published in the Classical Thistle about the role of assessments in classical education. Can you tell us a little bit more about this vision of assessment?
Well, when I wrote those articles, I spend time in classical schools and with homeschool parents talking about humane assessment. What are some, especially I started with homeschool assessment because homeschoolers, things look a little bit differently. They're not ranked, in their class. If they are, they're highly ranked usually because there's only a few. So some of those things don't really matter, and and parents would start to panic at about 9th grade when their education suddenly mattered. It counted. And I would remind them that their education has always counted, and they don't need to necessarily turn around and do something completely different, in 9th through 12th grade. They can continue to do what they're doing, and we would talk about assessment in real life. And so assessment, prior to the 1900s, we didn't have, grade points, ABCDs, standardized tests, even written assessments were actually, that's fairly new. It's not even 150 years old, really, the standard. And Horace Mann actually brought it's called the Prussian system, because the Prussians were the first ones to have kind of a public school system, and Horace Mann brought that to the United States, and they had grades and summative tests. So that wasn't even done before the 1800s. And actually, and I got a lot of this. Brian Williams wrote a great article about the history of assessment in Principia, which is a peer-reviewed classical education journal. So I love this article, and because it gave me all the background stats that I really need, the history of it. So that's where I got a lot of this information. This is all relatively new. People would be assessed. It was a relationship. So you were assessed within a relationship with a tutor, within a small group, and it was really walking alongside. And so I remind parents that, especially homeschool parents, that that's what they're doing. They're assessing in relationship, and assessment is not just a test. Assessment is just observing and living, and it's a conversation. We assess things all the time. We assess people. We assess our children. In my favorite way to assess my children is when I take them out of the country. I watch them and go, yes, they know this, and or oh no, we need to work on this. But the same holds too. I think we have a lot that we can learn from that kind of relational assessment that is natural in the homeschool sector. We can use that in our classical education, our classical schools as well. And so that's, what we're trying to do at Sager is to make sure that our students are loving the right things. They're not loving a grade. They're not loving a score. They're not achieving for the wrong reasons. I'm like you, Tracy. I wanted to be with the teacher, and I wanted to achieve those things. But I think too, we want to continue to have our students to love the learning process and not be so concerned about grades. There is, I think, a time and place for that, but I think that those articles really just kind of remind parents and teachers that there's many different kinds of assessments. There's many types of assessors. There's peers, there's mentors, and really it comes down to the self. The self has to be willing to change, and that's really what we are trying to do in classical education, is get to the soul of a student so that they can make those changes. And so I think we just need to be aware of that and assess at rest, at leisure, for the right things, and not just do things for the sake of doing them, not testing for the sake of testing, that we make it meaningful and engaging for our students.
So piggybacking off that, I want to go to Vince next. Our major industry conferences and assessment are coming up. So next week is the Association of Test Publishers that will be in Dallas, and then National Council on Measurement and Education is in Chicago in April. And one of the biggest topics on the agenda for those conferences is a topic of through course assessment. So Vince, I know Florida is moving towards this model. So what are your biggest hopes and fears when it comes to implementing through-year assessments, such as the one that Florida has recently launched with the FAST assessments? And for our audience that doesn't know what a through-course assessment is, can you define it for them and bring it into context here in Florida?
Yeah, thanks. Again, I also have to pick the main points here and stay short because there's a lot there. Governor DeSantis had heard a lot of the complaints that we've heard, and most states hear this. They give one end-of-year test, and parents, some states, like for example, Massachusetts, those students don't see the prior year scores until October of the next school year. We've always prided ourselves on getting the results out quickly, say within 30 days after the end of testing. But by then it's already June, almost July, and nobody really is paying much attention to those assessment results. So the main thrust of his initiative and what we rolled out in kind of record time, it was FAST, the Florida Assessment of Student Thinking, was to provide 3 times a year tests, shorter than any one of our end-of-year tests, so that teachers, parents, schools, districts got results that were actionable, showing strengths and weaknesses for a student or a class. And then we've also been able to get parent reports into the portal now within about 24 hours of a student completing their test with an official result. So that through-year assessment that we say, for example, we've given 10 million tests so far in the fall and the winter assessment. The next one opens in about 3 or 4 weeks for the last end of the year window. We want to see some growth. We want to see some actionable information that our colleagues in other areas of the department will actually go out there and help schools and districts with. And then we will refine the reports. We've already had some additional discussions with our contractor to enhance the reports and provide even more narrative and detail on how to help students succeed, not only for the next year, but within the year and as we move through the school year.
What are some of the biggest operational challenges you're seeing with measuring students across multiple time points? I know this is something that is being talked about extensively in the assessment industry. Can you share a little bit about some of your concerns with that for Florida?
A couple, we pivoted immediately. We had paper-based assessments in grades 3 through 6 for years. That was mandated in law, and it was mandated in law that we moved to computer-based testing basically immediately. So that was, although you'd say it was a challenge, it actually worked, really well. We only have about 1% of the students that can't access the computer. They have some disability. They have what we call an individual education plan that provides them with a paper-based assessment. We have, Braille, and so getting those results into the system so that even those students have the same benefit of immediate reporting has been somewhat of a challenge. But I will say, unlike previous times when we have challenges, I was just lucky that my worst fears did not come to fruition, that we were able to launch the system without issue. So that's been encouraging, and I think we have a lot of room for improvement too.
That's great. So moving on to talk a little bit about virtue, Bill, you wrote supplemental curriculum guides on civic virtue, including one which won a National Innovation Award from State Policy Network. Tell us more about this work and what role civic virtue has in education and in assessment practices.
Yeah, so within the work that we do, as you can imagine, being a group called the James Madison Institute, even though we are part of the State Policy Network and primarily focus on free market policies within our state, because of our name, we have for a number of years received questions and inquiries from teachers, from parents, from students who are working on term papers or history fair projects or things of that nature who will say, tell us about James Madison's Federalist Number 10, or what was Dolly Madison's role in the early American experience, and that sort of thing. So we developed 10 or 12 years ago a array of resources that are available to educators that help to provide some of those sorts of, to answer to some of those sorts of questions that's kind of separate and apart from our policy work. And a lot of the emphasis of this is in helping students grasp both the key ideas behind our system that James Madison in particular championed, as well as some of the underappreciated aspects of the way in which many of these things happened. I'm one who really believes Dolly Madison is sometimes, though she's well known in some respects and recognized as kind of one of the significant women in our early American experience, I think in some ways her role is sometimes underappreciated because she was very, she's known for being kind of the hostess with the mostest there, and her role at the White House in throwing these parties that were so popular that they became known as squeezes, because you had to kind of squeeze in. But in many ways, she understood that if our system was going to work, it was going to be important for people to develop relationships that allowed them to share ideas and get to know others and where they were coming from, rather than just having, kind of dry, dispassionate debates among strangers, if you will. And so there were things that I think she grasped and understood that proved to be very significant to the success of our early experiment. And one of the things that we then seek to do in some of the materials that we've developed is to recapture or help people appreciate some of those ideas that are lost. I mean, another project that we've done related to this is we've sought to kind of reinterest students in the concept of thrift, which Benjamin Franklin championed in his time and through his writings with Poor Richard's Almanac and things of that nature, and to help students understand that thrift was really a concept that had all sorts of kind of moral implications. It wasn't just simply how to maximize profit or how to get ahead financially, but was really all about the wise use of one's time, one's talent, one's treasure. And so those are some of the ways that we are seeking to come alongside teachers and parents and students and say, here are some ideas that we need to be sure that we don't overlook as we look at the early American experience and some of the people that were central to that.
Carrie, I'd like to transition back to you as a classical educator and mother who has now a college graduate for a son and a daughter who's currently in college. What advice do you have for educators and parents that are helping their students to prepare for college entrance exams and assessments in college?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't feel like I didn't worry about it a whole lot. So maybe that's my best advice, is to kind of trust the process of your education. If you're a classical educator, especially in my situation at home, I focused on the day-to-day learning, the education. In fact, my son did not take the CLT because it didn't exist yet, and I'm sad about that. My daughter did, and she loved the test. Actually, I can't believe that, she did. She's like, oh, that was not bad. That was fun, and I learned a lot. And here's the new people I want to read about. I've never heard a student say that about a test like that. So my advice was just helping parents prepare for those college years, whether they're in in a school or a homeschool situation, is continue to help your students focus on the things that are cultivating their virtue, because that's kind of the purpose of education, I think, and that's really the primary focus of a classical education, because the tests will come. I found out kind of at the last minute that the state of Arkansas did not accept the CLT for their challenge scholarship. It had to be an SAT or ACT. And so I found that out last minute, and I literally gave my daughter an ACT book the night before she took the ACT, and I said, "You're taking this test tomorrow." And she did fine. She did great. So, she got the score that she needed to get the scholarship. And so I would just say, if you're focusing on the virtues and you're focusing on those opportunities that they have, like in extracurricular activities, you're keeping up with that, you're helping them make transcripts and, kind of resumes that show how they operate as a whole person. I also highly recommend speech and debate. If they can be doing speech and debate, I think that's the pinnacle of rhetoric, and it's a goal of a classical education. And both of my students had a lot of opportunities and were able to practice articulating what they know and how they learn to people, and I think that helped them in their process in finding a college, and really not, yes, study for the SAT and ACT and the CLT, study for those things, study hard, but don't let yourself don't misalign your love to make those the highest thing. Make it about the purpose and the process. And I think those are the things that, if their goal is virtue, I think that will trump, all these things shall be added unto you.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on that, because I was actually a CLT customer way before I was a CLT employee. I learned about CLT from, she's actually in the room, Ashley Thorne, who is running this whole show over here. She wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2019, and it came into my inbox when I was eating lunch one day. And I was working from home, and I ran downstairs and asked my husband, "Did you know that there's a college entrance exam that's perfectly aligned to a classical education?" And he was like, "I had no idea. Like, we're both assessment geeks." And neither one of us knew about it. So my daughters were in middle school at the time. So I got CLT 8 for them. I was able to purchase it, and they took it right at home before dinner, after school. And then during dinner, being the kind of mom I am, I'm asking them 100 questions about it. Like, what were the passages like? What were the questions like? What did you like about it? Was it fun? Was it hard? Was it easy? And they basically said, "Mom, it wasn't like I was doing ballet or anything. Like, I don't love it like I love ballet, but as far as the test goes, it was pretty nice. I got to read a passage about, I don't remember who the author was, but the passage actually had a child that was praying to God for wisdom in solving this problem she was dealing with, which was amazing. And then there was a Federalist paper article on there, and a founding document. And I want to say maybe G.K. Chesterton was on there. And these are the same authors they're reading in school. And so both of my girls said, it was so different than taking the regular types of tests we take, because nothing was boring. Everything was really interesting and thought-provoking. And they literally did nothing to prepare for the test except get educated. That was it. That was their preparation, was to just read great things, talk about them, seminar about them, write about them. That was their entire preparation. There was no books, like practice books. There was no like Khan Academy. There was no like going to preparation classes. It was just read great things and talk about it and live a good life. And that was it. That was like their whole preparation. And just one more follow-up. When I was at University of Arkansas last month, I was a visiting scholar in the Department of Ed Reform, where Corey DeAngelis graduated from. And we were talking about classical education and the kind of passages that are on the CLT. And one of the audience members asked me, well, students who are, reading, Aristotle and Socrates and Thomas Aquinas and these kind of folks, like, wouldn't they have an advantage to do better on the CLT? And my answer was, yeah, they probably will, and that's the whole point. Is that they're reading things that are intellectually challenging. They're reading things that make them think, and they're reading things that they may not even necessarily agree with, and they're processing that, and it's making them come to convictions better about what they believe as well. So yes, if you're reading those kinds of things or similar kinds of things that are written with the same kind of rigor, and you're reading Shakespeare where you have to kind of step back and read it 3 times just to try to get what he's saying in the constellation of words he put together in this sentence, as opposed to someone who's just reading something that's written at a 6th grade level, then yeah, you're going to do better on the CLT if you're reading stuff like that. But that's the whole point of the assessment, right? Is to give information about your level of ability to interact with complex text. So the thing that I love most about the CLT is that you really don't have to do any special preparation. When I gave CLT 8 to my 3 of my kids have taken it now. We literally did 0 prep. I was like, there's 3 sections, 40 items each. They're timed. I'll time you. The end. You'll get your score like in 3 or 4 days. That was it. That was the only prep. And similarly, my son, when he took it, he thought the math section was so fun because it had all these logic problems on it. And he thought that was so much more fun than just doing the regular math that he did in class. Like this really challenged his brain, and just thought that was really fun to do so. So sorry for that extrapolation, but you got me motivated. Vince, moving on to you. This is kind of going back to what you just talked about with paper a little bit. We both served on the technical issues and large-scale assessment group for TILSA for several years with the Council of Chief State School Officers. And testing was often on, Florida testing was often on the agenda for the TILSA meetings. There was one year in time where you all went back to paper-based testing, and I remember there was a lot of jokes in the audience coming from that because there was jokes about like, what are we doing in Florida? Have we gone back to stone tablets or something? But now you're moving back into computer-based assessment. So tell us about how computer-based assessment has evolved in Florida over the years, and how that's a more improved experience for Florida today than it was maybe when you originally hosted computer-based assessments.
I'll point back to law. It's in law. Law changed. I think the idea was, and it's still philosophically interesting, although law doesn't just require computer-based tests. These assessments we're giving are required to be computer adaptive. So they respond to, if a student gets a question correct, then they get a more difficult question. The students who get questions wrong don't see many more difficult questions. So that's a significant, aspect of it. But I still see, when I was at charter school conference this past summer, I had a charter school principal said that their charter school really tried to stay away from all things technology, and could they please give the assessment on paper? And I said, because of state law, no. So there are quite a few people that think their students are digital natives. They need to be on computers because that's how kids write and interact in the real world, whether they go to college or get a job. But there are others that think that paper-based tests and paper is more appropriate for younger students. So I certainly get it and I hear it, but again, we're following law.
Bill, last question for you before we go to the audience. I'm getting direction from the back that I can't understand, so I'm just going to move on. I understand, and I had the opportunity to talk to your wife last night, that you have 4 adult children, and they benefited from multiple schooling arrangements growing up. Can you share a little bit more about this story, especially related to the role that assessments may have played in these differing assessments?
Yeah. So when our oldest came along, our daughter, will always be a drama queen in the very best sense of the word. And when we were looking for a way to educate her and to kind of meet her needs as best as possible when she was young, she was really torn because she was involved in a classical ballet program that she loved, but she wanted to start doing some theater. And we learned about this homeschool theater troupe that was near where we were living that practiced during the daytime, right after lunch, kids would do their work in the mornings, and then they'd all gather for rehearsals. And then they would perform on the weekends at a dinner theater. And this turned out to be one of the most fascinating sociological experiments I've ever been a part of. Because the group at that time, this was the early 90s, it kind of represented the full spectrum of homeschooling at the time. The artistic director was a kind of neo-hippie, chain-smoking, former nudist. The producer who kept all the trains running on time was a conservative Christian military wife who was so disciplined and orderly that she had, I kid you not, school uniforms for her homeschool that the kids wore. So you could not find two more different people to lead an enterprise than this. And there were amongst, between those two poles, if you will, all sorts of folks in between. And we ended up translating kind of back and forth for folks. But what was fascinating about that we really grew to appreciate is that people came to this experience and came to homeschooling for very different reasons, very different motivations. The neo-hippie woman was, as you can imagine, an unschooler. The military wife was very orderly and regimented in the way that she approached education. But out of that experience, we saw this kind of profound mutual respect that each had for the other because they cared enough about their kids to devote so much time to their education. And so even though no one would have ever put their kids full-time under the leadership of the other, nevertheless, all of the group, I think, came away saying, we want to respect parental authority and parental rights and to be wary of people who come in and say no to this or no to that. And I think for that reason, that experience has kind of shaped a lot of the way that I come at a lot of these public policy questions that we wrestle with. The discussion this morning I found fascinating about the Wild West and, whatnot. As I was thinking about this, I'm probably not Wild West, but I'm like Wild West adjacent. And and I want to give freedom because I trust and respect parents. And no parents, yes, there will always be parents that'll do things that I may not feel comfortable with, seeing my own kids do. But I've been around enough parents who come at things very differently to say, ultimately, I trust them more than some outsider who comes and wants to impose something on them, from the government. And so, and part of the reason why I love CLT, by the way, is just that much like that enterprise that, put on these performances at that dinner theater, it was an organic, that was a very organic sort of group that kind of sprung up from the bottom up and saw a need and sought to address it. And my sense as I look at CLT is I'm like, this would have never happened if you had asked a group of government officials to put together a test.
Yeah.
This is never where they would have landed. Yeah. And yet I trust this to be a much better way of assessing classical educators and students than anything that might have been put together by central planners.
Bill, with that, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel, and I hope that you have a slightly better view of assessment now than you did an hour ago. Thank you, everyone.